work is we'll have two panels. This panel will go from 3 to 4:30. We'll have half an hour break. There'll be some food and drink in the back of this room. And then at 5:30 till 7, we'll have the second panel. As Maddie said, this panel will address the issue of how the relationship between religion and politics has changed over the past quarter century. To my immediate left is Kim Daniels, who is the director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. She is a member of the Vatican Dicastery for Communication. I don't think I've ever met somebody who was a member of a dicastery. That's quite impressive. She's a member of the Vatican Dicastery for Communication and served in the 2021-24 Synod on Synodality as an expert participant, as a member of the Synod Communications Commission, and as coordinator of one of the 10 major synodal study groups. To her left is Jonathan Laurence, who is literally my next-door neighbor. He is professor of political science at Boston College, and he is also the director of the Clough Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy. His principal areas of teaching and research are comparative politics and religion and politics in Western Europe, Turkey, and North Africa. His most recent book, and it's an excellent book, I confess, is called Coping with Defeat, Sunni Islam, Roman Catholicisms, and the Modern State. And to his left is Michael Sean Winters, who is a columnist at the National Catholic Reporter, and I always introduce him as the Bishop Whisperer. He knows every bishop. He has their cell phone numbers inside his pocket. He is also the U.S. correspondent for The Tablet, the London-based International Catholic Weekly. He is a fellow at the Center for Catholic Studies at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield. Please join me in welcoming them. So I thought the liturgy, to speak Catholic speak for a minute, the liturgy will go like this. Each of our panelists will have 7 minutes to talk about how they see the relationship of religion and politics has changed. And at the end of that, of their 3 presentations, we'll have a brief conversation, depending on how lively the conversation is, and then I will open up the conversation with all of you. So we will become a committee of the whole, and all of you are more than welcome to join the conversation. So Kim, do you want to start?
This all set? Great. I just want to thank you for having me, Mark, and everybody. I'm really honored and grateful to be here for the Boisi Center's 25th anniversary. Our question today focuses on how the relationship between religion and politics has changed over the past 25 years. I'm going to narrow my remarks to one thread, one I think that reveals larger dynamics at play. I'll focus on how conservative Catholic engagement in U.S. public life has changed over the past quarter century and the fallout of that. But before we start, though, it's worth recalling earlier Catholic contributions to U.S. public life. From the 1919 Bishop's Plan for Social Reconstruction, a kind of blueprint for the New Deal, to the pro-life movement of the late 1960s and 1970s, which scholar Daniel K. Williams has reminded us started at kitchen tables with anti-war protesters and civil rights leaders. The Bishop's 1983 pastoral letter, The Challenge of Peace, or the 1986 pastoral letter, Economic Justice for All. Catholics have long brought throughout this process a distinctive moral vision to public life, rooted in solidarity and the dignity of the human person. So how did we get from there to here, to a moment when 56% of U.S. Catholics supported Donald Trump in the 2024 election? That's a complex story, and today I'm just going to trace one thread of that story, conservative Catholic proximity to political power and money, and will argue that it has left damaging results in its wake for the U.S. Catholic Church, for the credibility of our public witness, and for our country. I'll touch briefly on 3 areas. First, where we are then and where we are now. Second, the damage caused by this intertwining of faith, money, and power. And third, how we might respond. So first, where were we then? Where are we now? At the turn of the millennium, Catholics held broad sway in conservative politics. Richard John Newhouse and other Catholic intellectuals had spent the 1990s building an alliance between evangelical Protestantism and conservative Catholicism, in effort to reclaim what Newhouse famously called the naked public square from secular elites. Newhouse's project was animated by a belief that America could be renewed through religious engagement in public life, a conviction that shaped the Religious Rights Alliance with the GOP. Yet by the mid-1990s, Newhouse and his colleagues were warning that American democracy itself was losing legitimacy. The 1996 First Things Symposium, The End of Democracy, declared that the U.S. regime might be illegitimate because it had become detached from the moral law. Such rhetoric, casting secular liberal democracy as morally corrupt and perhaps beyond repair, foreshadowed the arguments of today's post-liberal Catholic thinkers. During the Bush years, Catholic conservatives gained real access to power. Bush, though an evangelical Protestant, relied heavily on Catholic intellectual frameworks. By 2008, Religion News Service was asking whether Bush was leading America's first truly Catholic presidency. Presciently, that 2008 RNS article cites one Leonard Leo for the assertion that the approximately 300 judges Bush had seated on the federal bench, most notably Catholics John Roberts and Sam Alito on the Supreme Court, may yet be his greatest legacy. Then over the following decades, especially after Citizens United in 2010 and its unleashing of new ways for money to shape politics, conservative Catholic influence became increasingly well-funded, professionalized, and partisan. A network of well-financed Catholic organizations emerged that was aligned closely with GOP priorities. This ecosystem has operated through sophisticated media narratives, networks, and donor-driven advocacy groups that use Catholic identity as a political instrument, often weaponizing it to advance partisan agendas. This instrumentalization of faith, using it as a means to political power, has had lasting costs for the church and public life. The first and most profound cost has been to our faith itself. Political scientist Ryan Burge data shows that young Catholics are leaving the faith not because they reject faith or moral seriousness, but often because they see the church as captive to politics. This politicization has also fractured our witness. The church's social teaching offers a coherent, integrated moral vision, but after decades of our Catholic faith being deployed towards partisan ends, that integrated moral vision has been left publicly in tatters. The result is a divided and diminished witness and a public voice less able to draw people towards the fullness of the gospel. And this instrumentalizing of our faith has also harmed our witness in public life. Catholics have been brought close to power but further from the gospel. Too many Catholic voices have been muted when that power has been abused, when the vulnerable, the poor, migrants are scapegoated, when democratic norms are eroded, and when lies about elections are spread. As Damon Linker recently wrote, the result is that the religious right today is both weaker than it used to be and stronger than it's ever been. Weaker because religion itself has receded in American public life, and stronger because it has found new alliances with the post-religious right, a movement that denigrates empathy as weakness. Bishop Daniel Flores has warned of this danger, naming what we all sense, a creeping indifference, a systemic vilification of compassion and mercy, all of which, he says, affect the poor and vulnerable, from the unborn to the abandoned elderly. This is not the gospel, and it is not the witness that our times demand. So finally, where do we go from here? First, we stand with the poor and vulnerable, especially migrants who have become scapegoats in our political culture. As Cardinal Robert McElroy has warned, we are witnessing a comprehensive governmental assault designed to produce fear and terror among millions of people, and we're called to peacefully stand in solidarity with them. Second, we defend the rule of law and democratic norms as essential to human dignity. In Athens in 2021, Pope Francis warned against what he called a retreat from democracy, urging nations to resist the siren songs of authoritarianism. And he reminded us that democracy is a moral undertaking. To uphold it is part of our vocation as citizens and believers. Third, we embrace principled dialogue and pluralism, which is foundational to Catholic engagement in a diverse modern democracy. Pope Leo reminds us just recently that now is the time for dialogue and for bridge building. And we know that sociologist James Davison Hunter warned us so long ago that a culture war mindset, a winner-takes-all approach to politics, almost always ends badly. What's needed is not victory but encounter, not uniformity but solidarity. And then finally, just some signs of hope. First, like his predecessor, Pope Leo models a humble outward-facing church, rooted in the gospel and engaged with the world. He's already shown the courage of his convictions and his willingness to place those who are poor at the center of our faith and stand up for migrants and a consistent ethic of life. The ongoing Global Synod is another sign of hope. Messy, of course, but a global process in which people are walking together through many disagreements, listening, learning, and walking with each other. So to just conclude and wrap it up, too often over these last 25 years, Catholics have confused access with influence and power with witness. What's needed now is not just unity, but solidarity. Solidarity rooted in the gospel, grounded in the dignity of all, especially the vulnerable, and open to encounter across our divisions. This is the way to what Pope Francis called a better kind of politics.
Kim, as a pro, I asked you to speak for 7 minutes, and that's exactly what you did. So because usually academics have never met a microphone they don't like. So thank you, Kim. Jonathan.
Thank you, Mark. I'm grateful for this invitation to celebrate the 25th anniversary of programming and research at the Boisi Center. It gives me an opportunity to recognize the role it has played on campus for students over many years, to give a word of thanks and acknowledgement for its leader today and also its leaders over the years. Alan Wolf, Eric Owens, who is here with us, who was instrumental to building the whole thing up, and of course Susie Richards, who has been there throughout as the soul of the house. And again, thanks to our host for this invitation, whom I'll say we get to know him through his impressive books and his sort of trenchant pen, and then we realize what a delightful human being he is, not only because he's frank and witty, but also because he promotes BC students tirelessly. I've seen it, and he's also a great friend to young faculty. So these are important roles. Thank you, Mark. So this is a welcome occasion to reflect on how things have changed in the past 25 years in my area, which is religion in the Middle East and Europe, and specifically the issue of Islam's status as a majority and minority religion, and how that has weighed upon American perceptions and aims with our own foreign policy. In the 20th century, the central actors in our geopolitical order found a way to address the issue of Catholicism in the modern world, in part by creating the Vatican City, a sovereign territory where the Pope could rule autonomously. And we know well that the nation-state was also created as a haven for the long-suffering Jewish people with the state of Israel. We also know that neither of these solutions was perfect. But there are few perfect solutions in the universe of religion and politics. Over the last 25 years, the world's powers have finally attempted to address the fundamental issue, I would say, of compatibility between Islam and contemporary politics, and to try and resolve what you might consider to be the colonial hangovers in the Muslim world. So back in the year 2000, these issues were not very visible to the American public. For the most part, there was no debate about Islam in the West or elsewhere. There was instead a general ignorance about the slumbering issue of Islam's place in the world order. The extent that religion in Europe and the Middle East played a role in American public life, it was to animate a limited but ambitious function for U.S. foreign policy. There was, of course, the Pax Americana that has helped to calm oil markets and secure trade routes, and has done so with military bases around the world, secured by our roving nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Our diplomats had brokered peace between Israel and Egypt, and then between Israel and Jordan, and they were expecting at this time, around the fall of 2000, that they would soon be able to carve out a solution, a two-state solution in Israel and Palestine, with the hope that this would sideline radicals and unlock democracy across the region. So this optimism has been set aside as several major developments tested these assumptions over the last 25 years. First, the notion that history had ended and that liberal democracy or market capitalism had won was interrupted. in part by a decade of terror attacks that exposed the unstable equilibrium of the post-colonial world. And I'm referring, of course, to 9/11 in the US, March 11th in Madrid 4 years later, July 7th in London shortly after that, January 7th and November 13th in 2015 in Paris. This all led to a flurry of policy-making, war-making, and state-making, including US-backed military interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. There were some notable successes mixed in, including a brief hope in the Arab Spring during the 2010s. But the end result has been foreign policy fatigue among the US public after failed revolutions and even a short-lived Islamic State. So it became clear that US foreign policy ambitions needed to be scaled back because at the same time, something else was happening on the home front, which is to say the ripening of long-festering domestic challenges which rose to the level of crisis. Hurricane Katrina first, and then the financial crisis several years after that, made it impossible to ignore that history had not ended in the US either. The long election of the year 2000 and Bush v. Gore that resolved it, looking back, seems to be a critical thread that, once pulled, has continued to unravel confidence in both our electoral system and the Supreme Court. That, and the rekindling of cultural war fronts during 12 years of Obama-Biden and 5 years and counting of Trump, have these fault lines been laid bare, revealing unsustainable inequalities and dividing lines, and differing attitudes towards the sanctity of democratic institutions. So what hasn't changed? Well, Israel and Palestine are still a recurrent burning issue. It has been near impossible to achieve an agreement that sticks, from Oslo through Camp David to this afternoon. But I would categorize the non-resolution of the Israel-Palestine issue as a symptom and not the cause of tensions in the Middle East. The main lesson that the lack of resolution in Jerusalem reveals is the questionable legitimacy of the political order across the Middle East and North Africa. Because ever since the end of the Ottoman Empire, there's been an empty seat where the Sultan Caliph once sat in Istanbul. And that has left open very important questions, such as who represents Muslims and Islams worldwide? Who interprets the religious law? Who governs and is the custodian of Islam's holiest sites? And who is responsible for protecting Muslims militarily when they come under attack? That vacuum is the breach where Al-Qaeda and ISIS step in. So now we're living with a region that has been restructured by our shifting alliances and some unintended foreign policy consequences, including some that were due to our own success at dislodging old enemies. And we may finally be arriving at an answer. After 9/11, the US reined in Saudi Arabia as an exporter of radical ideologies. It eliminated Afghanistan as a safe haven for Al-Qaeda, and it helped to democratize Iraq at great human and financial cost. The disciplining of the old Sunni hegemons actually led to a shift towards Shia balance of power in the region, thanks to these very interventions. So Iran, which is of course majority Shia, was left as the only real resistance leader against the US-led geopolitical order, which of course included Israel. And so Iran took over patronage, of course, of the armed groups like Hamas, which brings us to the turning point of October 2023, which was an attempt to place the Islamic Republic of Iran atop global Muslim leadership. So, to conclude, what does this mean for religion and public life in the US and for views of Israel or views of the holy sites of Islam? Well, the attacks of October 2023 provoked, of course, an asymmetrical war that achieved its intended effect, which was to isolate Israel from its allies. Most of the public can only really recall that last step in the process, which were the images of Israel hammering Gaza in retaliation. And in Western publics, something has come full circle. from the UN Conference on Racism that was held in Durban, South Africa in the year 2000. And you might even count it as a major victory for Israel's enemies. Because what had been a controversial and arguably anti-Semitic statement, namely that Zionism equaled racism, has become acceptable discourse. Incidentally, Iran's decision to back Hamas's attack on Israel may well have led indirectly to the election of an anti-Zionist mayor in one of the largest Jewish cities in the world. But it has also had an unintended effect, because by revealing the complicity of all those who were not explicitly at war with the US and Israel, it has shifted the calculus within the Sunni bloc, which has been seeking a deal for Jerusalem, and which we saw a glimmer of at Sharm el-Sheikh the other week. So the central irony, 25 years after the Boisi Center came online, is that the US has been thrust back into the middle of it all, despite having a president elected on an isolationist platform rejecting foreign wars in both 2000 and 2024. We remain the brokers who provide the bulk of the carrots and the sticks, and as such we bear the brunt of the blame and the lion's share of the credit when things go right. Why? Well, in part because of our military might, but also because we, through dint of history, served as a country of refuge for millions of Jews who continue to be active citizens. So with luck and continued pressure, the peace process may soon come to a successful conclusion, if only because all other options have been exhausted. But our desire for democracy may well take a back seat to our worry about the stability of our allies, and to take what we can get from those who are willing to sign an imperfect agreement. And just maybe, that will let us get back to the work of nation building at home. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Michael Sean.
So in a talk in 1998, Cardinal Francis George said that conservative Catholicism was becoming sectarian, as Kim has outlined, and that liberal Catholicism was, quote, an exhausted project, close quote. He repeated the latter phrase in a Commonweal symposium the next year. A few years after that, I was reminded, looking at the pictures, I made my first appearance here at a Boisi event in 2008. I shudder to think the students in the room were probably in first grade at the time. Anyway. So after this challenge from Cardinal George, the Boisi Center was founded in the mind of God and here on the campus of Boston College. In the 25 years that followed, liberal Catholicism, as it pertains to the political life of the nation, went from exhausted to moribund and also sectarian. The Catholic left today follows its secular counterpart slavishly and has become the chaplain to the establishment, chasing after culturally extreme ideas, no longer distinctly Catholic or distinctly liberal. It helped pave the way for Trumpism and still seems anemic in its response. As late as the 2010 debate over the Affordable Care Act, there were more than a dozen pro-life Democrats who insisted that the ACA abide by the restrictions on elective abortion contained in the Hyde Amendment. In the wake of that debacle, the leader of the pro-life Democrats, Congressman Bart Stupak, retired, and others, Kathy Dahlkemper, Steve Dreyhus, and others, lost their re-election bids, stuck between a pro-life movement that had become an arm of the Republican Party and a Democratic Party that has become synonymous with the pro-choice movement. There is not a single Democrat in the United States House or Senate with a pro-life voting record today. The seamless garment became the invisible garment. Recently, Cardinal Cupich caused a stir when he decided to give an award to Senator Dick Durbin for his work on migration. Other bishops objected to the award because Durbin is pro-choice. Asked about the controversy, Pope Leo endorsed emphatically the seamless garment approach to life issues. Did a single Catholic Democrat see in the Pope's intervention an opportunity to articulate any opposition to abortion or to euthanasia, any limits on either procedure? If they did, they kept it to themselves. I can't think of a self-identified liberal Catholic who has challenged the liberal orthodoxy on transgender issues, even when Pope Francis denounced gender ideology and when the Cass report in the United Kingdom demonstrated how flimsy the evidence was for irrevocable surgeries or puberty blockers on adolescents. Are Catholic Democrats more likely to be leading the effort to create an alternative to neoliberal politics? I don't see that. Do Catholic environmental activists sound any different from secular environmental advocates? Do liberal Catholic politicians defend the right of our Catholic hospitals to refuse to perform procedures that violate our Catholic beliefs? How many liberal Catholics even consider religious liberty an important concern? The Catholic left has adopted the identity politics of the secular left, despite the obvious difficulties, or one would think they are obvious, Christian anthropology poses to a sense of self that is rooted in membership in a group. Catholics believe in the transcendent dignity of the human person and the universal call to holiness and salvation. Yes, our commitment to subsidiarity recognizes the need for robust civil society organizations, but that is not how identity politics works, is it? Well-funded lobbying groups based in Washington, armed with extensive mailing lists, define what it means today to be black or Latino or gay or a woman in the public political sphere. Genuinely local groups, the Elks, the Bridge Club, those serve to bring people of different political beliefs and religious ideas together, and those groups have withered on the vine. Now we all bowl alone. Identity politics separates people from one another. It creates silos, a process now reinforced by the technology of social media. The Catholic left in the U.S. is largely divorced from the concerns of the working class and organized labor. Show of hands. Who's used Amazon lately? Uber. Starbucks. These are three of the most anti-union companies in the country, and we social justice Catholics use them because they're convenient. Enriching Jeff Bezos is the 21st century equivalent of crossing a picket line. Not to be rude to my hosts, but universities, including Catholic universities, are now part of the problem. The principal marker of polarization in our politics is the so-called diploma divide. Our Catholic schools issue the very document that is the totem of polarization. Where is the self-scrutiny? The principal reasons Democrats lose elections is because the party's politicians no longer talk like they just came off the factory floor. Now they sound like they just left the faculty lounge. This is a recipe for losing elections. As Catholics, those of us on the left have to ask ourselves a difficult question. There is ample evidence that the more religious observant a Catholic is, the more likely they are to attend Mass regularly or to pray the rosary or to participate in a novena, the more likely they are to lean to the right politically. This is true here and throughout the West. In the post-Vatican II era, there has been much talk about the sensus fidelium, the sense of the faithful. But faithful is a word with a meaning, full of faith. If the people most likely to practice the faith consistently prefer conservative politics to liberal politics, we need to find out why. I suspect that once you clear away all the variables that political analysis entails, the reason is that 21st century liberalism has become a champion of the idea that volition creates morals, that we are free to do whatever we want, that there is no moral order embedded in the universe to which we should hold ourselves accountable. Obviously, many liberal Catholics conduct their lives in ways that do recognize such a moral order. They help out at the soup kitchen and donate to the homeless shelter and to CRS. They find Trumpism morally repugnant. Yet insofar as the Catholic left has participated in the reduction of religion to ethics, our social vision became untethered from its doctrinal roots. It may or not be compelling to people, but has lost its distinctively Catholic sensibility. It fails to generate culture, and a faith that no longer generates culture is a dead faith. In short, the Catholic left has become as sectarian as the Catholic right, and as anemic as the secular left. This is one of the saddest stories of the past 25 years.
Thank you, microphone. Wow. I guess I want you to question each other, but I guess my first question is, I reviewed a book that Christian Smith, who's a famous sociologist of religion at Notre Dame, just published called Why Religion Went Obsolete in the United States. And the statistics he offers a bunch of numbers. Statistically, 40% of young people claim no religious. They claim to be nuns. They don't have a religion. They're spiritual but not religious. But a significant and growing number of adults also headed in that direction. But when he interviewed young people, he asked them why they'd given up on traditional religion, and they said because religion on both the left and the right is so closely tied to politics that they've lost their faith in religion's ability to stand alone and offer some sort of ground to stand on. Do you think Christian Smith was right?
Start? Go ahead and start. I think yes. I think I would agree with that thesis. And I want to say, though, I don't want to be hopeless about it, right? Because we do see places where there is some revival of a Christian witness, of a Catholic witness in public life, and I think it's indicative of where we might go forward. And what I want to point to is the Eucharistic procession in, I guess it was in Minnesota, right? It was in Chicago, going to an ICE detention facility. And so a parish had hundreds of people following the Eucharist going to protest at an ICE detention facility and tried to get in to offer the sacraments. And to my mind, there's politicization, which is driving people away, and I think that's more linked to partisanship. When people see their faith instrumentalized for partisan political ends. But as Catholics, we know that we're called to be engaged in public life, right? That we're called, politics is a good thing, and we're called to be there. And so it's not that makes people leave, it's the partisanship. And what can draw people back, hopefully, whether it does or not, what we're called to do is that kind of public witness that directly serves those who are suffering.
Interesting.
Well, this actually makes me think of the question I had for Michael Sean, tying together increases of the sort of the more religious, the more pious you are, the more conservative you tend to be. And so I guess I would be curious whether that really holds, given some of the inconsistencies that you pointed out. So if you have a higher consistency in religious practice, does this really mean, say, that you have a greater consistency with regard to how you define life, right? So, or is it spiritual, or is it a religious cloaking of a sort of selective partisan positions? If, for example, you are fine with the death penalty, but not fine with Dick Durbin, receiving the award.
So first, I want to start with the Christian Smith point. I am sure that's what the students responded, the young people responded, and I think there's something to that. But I think the thing that they don't want to admit, that none of us want to admit, is its affluence. There's a reason religion has declined in the West. We got rich. Luke 4 says, I've come to preach good news to the poor. We're not poor anymore. We just don't even hear it the same way. We rely on ourselves, right? We're educated. We go about our business. We're very successful. The stance of the religious in the Christian tradition is a supplicant. It's a position of needy. And so I think to your point and to Kim's that it was nice to see a more pietistic devotion, a Eucharistic procession being married with a desire to bring the Eucharist to probably unlawfully, definitely immorally detained migrants at a detention center in Chicago. There needs to be more of that, things that break through the culture. I can remember the former Archbishop of this city, Cardinal Sean O'Malley, going to the border fence in Nogales, Arizona, with Jerry Kakanis, the Bishop of Tucson. And they had Mass there, and they served the communion wafers through the slats in the border fence. Now, I can't think of a better portrayal of politics trumping a political division, including in this case a political boundary. To your question, I think the totem that abortion placed, the role that abortion as an issue played as to what it meant to be a verifiably sincere Catholic in the public square was so dominant that we're living on that exhaust to a degree that has now been replaced by the transgender issue, I think, as a totem of the culture warriors. And, but on both of those, the position of the church was not ambiguous. And I'll close just by saying, to go back to Mark's point, the price of admission has to be, and if those students he was interviewing or young people he was interviewing came to me, I'd say, do you challenge your own side politically? On Catholic grounds. That's the price of admission to any useful conversation about overcoming polarization in America. If you're not willing to call out your side, you really can't contribute.
Well, okay. I have a question about, we've been talking primarily about Catholics, and Christian Smith is himself a Catholic, teaching at a Catholic university, but the majority of his correspondents were not Catholics. They were Protestant, evangelicals, and Jewish students as well. Do you think the story is the same across that divide in terms of Protestant, Catholic, Jew, or is this a Catholic problem in some unique way?
Just to get us started, I think it's when we talk about the way that the media reaches everybody now, so that we're not siloed into different religious communities in the way we might have been generations ago. I think that the kind of instrumentalization of our religious faith, regardless, whether, and again, this is obviously painting with very broad brushstrokes, but my sense would be that young people in particular, and others as well, are struck by that instrumentalization, and they recoil from it. And at the same time, I really, really agree with Michael Sean's point that the test of the authenticity of your commitment to your faith is that, are you willing to challenge people on your own side, right? I don't know what that says about our parties or about Catholics. The trope is that Catholics are politically homeless. We don't have a home in any party. And I think the question on the table for us here is, well, what does that mean for our political engagement? It's one thing to talk about small local interventions, and that's terrific, and more power to them. But what does it mean on a national level? And how do we do that in a way that is authentic and that brings the next generation along by a demonstration of our political witness being aligned with our faith?
Jonathan, is the Jewish story different?
Well, no, I don't think it's very different. I think that you have also a lot very similar falling away from the faith and from community organizations for some of the same reasons that Michael Sean was pointing out. And it reminds me of this, Aesop's fable that was sometimes used in discussions of Jewish emancipation, which was the contest between the wind and the sun to get a man to remove his overcoat. And the argument with regard to the Jews was that, well, the fiercer the wind blows, persecution-wise, then the tighter they're going to cling to their peculiar ways and garments, and whereas the warmer the sun of citizenship and rights and duties and all of that, then they're more likely to sort of shed their coat. So part of this is it's sort of a success story, like you were saying it is, and that's a different kind of apathy than a loss of belief in the fundamental values. It's more having to do with a blissful indifference or ignorance of those values because they feel they've won in some ways, and in many ways they have. I mean, moving on to the transgender issue from the abortion issue is proof of such victories. But I think to zoom out, what's remarkable is just the extreme comfort with which Catholics can participate politically in the public sphere, which is quite remarkable, right, in this country, because it would really, you wouldn't have to go back too many generations to find exceedingly conspiratorial and anti-Catholic imagery, accusations of popery, of anti-democratic behavior. And so the fact that we've sort of gone through a whole cycle and now we're like, well, we have to get back into the political mobilization. It's remarkable when you think about it that we're just talking about a revival, finding the wind for the sails again. The sails are there. That's incredible in itself.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is I think there's the churches have not been immune to politics subsuming the culture. I just did a column on this where, think about this. So politics has now infested itself into the debate about which rock star performs at the Super Bowl. You know, sports and popular music have both converged as part of a political debate. This is insanity. But politics is just, swallowing up the rest of the culture, and the churches have not been immune from that. In the case of Catholics, and I'll bet there's something similar in Judaism, but I wouldn't speak to that without doing a whole lot more reading. And I'll use an academic analogy to get away from politics for a minute. We all know the Land of Lakes statement about the need for Catholic universities to be independent, and how that was completely necessary, and in the moment, it was absolutely, there was no alternative. That either happened or Catholic education would have died in the 70s. So when you go back and you read it, though, or you talk to people, one of my great mentors was John Tracy Ellis, who was very involved in the drafting of that statement. What they did not foresee at all was that the Catholic culture would not remain robust once Catholics moved to the burbs. Like, it was robust when you asked someone, where do you live? And they said, oh, I live in St. Bernadette's. Like, when the parish identified your neighborhood, when everyone in your thing, when you went to the Catholic schools, or at least enough, a majority of Catholic students never went to the Catholic school, but you knew the kids that did, and you went to cheer on their teams and all that. When we moved to the burbs and became affluent, that Catholic culture atrophied, and our institutions, including Catholic higher education, haven't really adjusted to that reality, that the culture used to support the faith. And I think part of the story of its susceptibility to politicization is that when the faith is no longer supported by the culture, it will become adherence to a set of ideas much more readily. It becomes a more ideologically prostitutable thing, because it becomes more notional and less cultural. You think about the debates that you have now in Catholic elementary and high school education, and to a degree here at higher education, about the Catholic mission of the school, the Catholic identity of the school. You go back to the 1950s, you never see a discussion of that. It walked in with the nuns and the brothers who were teaching the courses. It was in the air, everyone was breathing, and it's not now. And we've got to figure out what does a Catholicism look like that is not propositional, notional, intellectual, and privatized. And I'm open to ideas on that.
Kim?
Well, just to respond, just to pick up on something that you said, Jonathan, right? The idea, it really isn't that long ago, and you're talking about an era, right, when there really was anti-Catholicism in public life, when we weren't welcome in politics, such that, for instance, John F. Kennedy, to the Houston Baptist, has to say that his faith will not affect his politics, that there is a separation there. He comes out and says something that is just a direct line to Richard John Newhouse in the 80s and the 90s, saying there is a naked public square, and that is not how it's supposed to be, and that we are just as entitled to bring our religious beliefs to that public square as anyone else. And that is what drives us, right? And so the question is, what do we do now? Right, where now it's not what's happening now in public life is less a kind of deracination of that conversation, right, where it's very abstract and sort of up in the air and all about sort of rational principles. But now we're going so far in this post-liberal, post-religious right, frankly, where these dark emotions of violence and nihilism are what is capturing the conversation online and increasingly among young people. So we did have that sort of experience of, we're just having rational ethical arguments and that's not enough to hold it. My concern now is that now we're well past that, and now young people, but really so many people who are online are just captured by this nihilistic, violent, hostile vocabulary and way of being.
Interesting. Did you want to respond to this? See, I don't think this is a new thing. When John Paul II had a Papal Youth Day in Denver, when was that? What year was it?
96.
Peter Jennings, who's dead now and now knows, so there's no reason for speculation, he went up to this young lady who was holding this big sign that said, "I heart the Pope." And Peter Jennings said, like a 16-year-old girl, said, "Are you a fan of the Holy Father?" She says, "I really love Pope John Paul. I think he's the most important human being on earth. He's the center of the spiritual nexus of the world." And Peter Jennings said, "Are you aware that he's against premarital sex and the ordination of women?" And the young girl said, well, that's his personal opinion. That's his free to do it. And I thought, Houston, we have a situation here. I mean, so now back then, there's this sense that it seemed to me that religion had been privatized for this young lady, and she was simply projecting onto John Paul II what her own religious were, you know. So I think Michael Murphy had a great thing online last week when we were Zooming. He said, I always remind myself that my father said there's a reason why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, you know. So, and it's sort of like she wasn't listening, you know, sort of thing. My sense is that the truism is Catholics feel themselves homeless in terms of political parties. But I think they're not unique in that. Or do you disagree?
I don't even think that many feel themselves homeless now. I just think that they rationalize away the parts of their faith that challenge their political positions. I wish there were more people that felt homeless and felt tension. There's an amazing desire, and you get it on both the left and the right, to belong. This whole emphasis on belonging and all that. And, you know, we were discussing this at lunch last Thursday with Mark. Like, I'm not a huge fan of Herder, and Herder invented belonging as a political category. And he's not responsible for what the Nazis did with his political theory, but we should be attentive to the fact that the Nazis put that theory to good use. Like, the Hitler Youth, you felt like you belonged, and yet somehow this has become this big category. And I find the people who actually are the bump in the road on the tyrant's path are the people who are conflicted, who their lives don't add up, who do wrestle morally and can't always, you know. Leon Wieseltier had this great line in his essay Against Identity, which was, you know, 1997. It's worth rereading. And he said, you know, I hear it said of a man that he leads a double life, and I think to myself, just two? You know, but we need more of that. You know, I actually don't think the pluralism is a fact of American life. It always has been. Diversity is a fact of American life. But we don't need a multicultural society. That's a given. What we need is multicultural individuals. We need people who wrestle with this stuff in interesting ways. And I find the whole pressure of social media and the climate on a lot of college campuses is away from that. And they don't want to have the conversations and stay up till 4 o'clock in the morning. I mean, I went to college in the 80s. You always stayed up till 4 o'clock in the morning arguing about ideas. It was the 80s. We were all high, but that's a different story. But kids don't do that now because they don't want to be unfriended. So they talk about, you know, about pop music, and they talk, you know, and that has to get back into higher education, or we're really doomed.
Marie Griffiths is sitting in the first row here. You spent much of your distinguished career looking at evangelical Protestants. Do evangelical Protestants feel that they're homeless politically?
Thank you. Well, stay for my presentation and you'll see. I will be talking about that. But I mean, I think the short answer is yes, that there are, and I resonate with some of what Kim said, you know, kind of some of the younger Catholics leaving the church because of what they've seen. And I see younger evangelicals leaving because of the co-optation you know, of politics, of religion, of conservative evangelical religion. Right. So, yes.
So they would feel that politics has swallowed religious identity.
For sure.
Okay.
More soon.
Good. Questions? Okay. And
part of this is for Kim, and the second part is for everybody, and Mark is probably most able to speak to it. You talk about post-religious right. Is that another term for Christian nationalism, which seems to be rather out there these days? So that's one question. The other one is, what is going on when conservative Republicans at a Catholic university invite somebody to speak? This is the controversy of the week, I guess, to speak where being faithful and being on board is you'd be willing to die. You have to be willing to die. Yes. Yeah.
Well, I'll speak to the first one. Maybe I'll speak to the first question. Maybe I'll let you speak to the second. So sure, the category of post-religious right, an online phenomenon that has become a real-life phenomenon, that a subset of which is Christian nationalism, right? Is this idea that in many ways that we talk about a political driver, a loyalty to a nation, leading and in fact subsuming your religious identity, such that your religion becomes a part of that and is oriented towards your loyalty to the nation. And you look online right now, and if you haven't, I mean, I don't wade in these waters too much because it's just horrible, right? I mean, I take it as a woman. I'm really glad. I love liberalism because it means I can vote, and it means I have modern dentistry. There's all sorts of things you love about liberalism, but one of them is that it protects people who are vulnerable. And I'm so glad that women at least have the vote now, but there are people online who think we shouldn't anymore. There are people online who call themselves Catholic and who call themselves Christian, who think that women shouldn't vote, shouldn't go to college, shouldn't work outside the home. That those arguments are back now in a way, and those are almost the tamer arguments, I will just say. I mean, it's really just a sinkhole. And it's a scary place right now.
Are you talking about the Goiper movement?
Exactly.
Does anybody know what the Goiper? You need to. If you don't know this, you need to Google it. It's Goiper, Groyper. Google Goiper, but do it on a sunny afternoon because you'll be very upset.
Well, just on that last point, I would say we're still in an era of the internet and social media, which is totally unregulated, anonymous. We have no idea who's who. I'm not saying that those are Russian bots, but it's hard to know how much to read into some of the online phenomena. And when they become real, that's of course, then you don't need to discuss it anymore because the effect has been had.
But you can see these articles now in journals that used to be, First Things will run Scott Yenner writing about these things, or who I wouldn't put in the category of Groypers, obviously, but I just mean to say that it gives a permission structure to people to now chin scratch and say, here's where we are, and let's have a serious discussion about it. And many of us thought that discussion was a long time over.
Good. It's like, question to the audience, yes. Megan Sweeney in the back.
This is for Professor Driscoll. Thank you all. In particular, I find conservative evangelical Protestants and conservative Catholics make interesting bedfellows. I'm wondering from your observations where there might be fractures, and so where might some alliances actually fall apart?
So I would say along immigration. I think that if you look at the U.S. now, and again, I want to step back and say we need to have a stronger, more united witness in the Catholic Church on the issue of standing in solidarity with migrants right now. I mean, as a baseline. But I want to say that if you think of an issue around which the U.S. bishops, for instance, really do stand in solidarity. One is abortion, and the other is migration and immigrants, and standing for the human dignity of immigrants. And I think that you're starting to see cracks as you start to see more and more bishops and other Catholic leaders stand up, whether it be a parish deciding they're going to take the Eucharist to an ICE detention facility and they're going to have a procession in the street, or whether it's people accompanying migrants to their hearings to make sure that they have someone with them, or whether it's the clinic, Catholic Legal Immigration Network helping tell people their rights, or whether it's bishops writing and speaking and standing on the steps of courthouses. Those are all Catholic efforts around the country right now to stand in solidarity with migrants. And to my mind, that is a place where our history, we are an immigrant church, and we have spent generations serving immigrants in this country, and I think that's starting to show through in the cracks.
Question. Eric.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I guess I'm curious how you see the lack of commitment in religion that you're describing. Michael Sean, you described it, but others too, as related to the broader decline of social trust in our society. Americans say that they don't trust their doctors or lawyers or Congress or priests or their neighbors or congresswomen or anything. Like there's been an arch cynicism and a rising level of suspicion driven by our politics of a certain sort. So I guess I wonder whether you see the failures of religion in our country as ahead of that curve or behind that curve. Do they suffer from a general decline and attack on trust in institutions, or were they a leading indicator of that across traditions? And I think we're hearing more about the Catholic tradition, so I'm also interested in across other traditions.
I'll go first on that. I think that obviously for the Catholics, the sex abuse crisis was the gut punch. Would this decline in trust have happened anyway? Probably. I think, David, Mike, and Mark and I have been organizing these gatherings of bishops and theologians the last 4 years. And the very first one at Loyola, I don't even know what prompted it, but Cardinal McElroy got up and he said, underneath so much of our discussion is the problem that we have a gospel of grace and gratitude, and we live in a culture of grievance. And I think that culture of grievance is what feeds the hermeneutic of suspicion about establishments and all that. And I think we've lost the degree to which we preach a gospel of grace and gratitude. The most, you think of the way the left embraced Francis on economic issues. The most radical comment on economic issues since Vatican II was Benedict XVI saying, we have to reintroduce a notion of gratuitousness into our economic. Now, he didn't spell it out, but man, that challenges the root, not just the results of capitalism, but the roots of it in a really radical way. And I think there's how you build, the only way you rebuild that trust is like the most effective advertising for a restaurant in a neighborhood, not for tourists, is what? It's word of mouth. And I think the only way the church is going to restore that trust is by word of mouth, is by us living our lives in a way that other people say, hey, what is that guy or that gal going on that I don't have going on in my life? And they ask you and you say, well, I do this because I believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. I always tell some of my bishop friends, when you get up, your authority is not as a part of the, you have one authority. You are a successor of the apostles. You are a successor to those who witnessed the empty tomb. And so when you want to make a public statement, if you can't tie it in one page to the empty tomb, let somebody else say it. But that's your authority. And so I do think also we have to measure our civic engagement that way too, which is if you can't tie it to the empty tomb, somebody else should be making those arguments. And I find this is the problem of teaching social ethics in most seminaries and universities. It's taught as like this standalone thing. It's not rooted in the Christian anthropology, in the ecclesiology. And if it's standalone, our ethics, whether it's sexual or social, they weren't meant to stand alone. And with the whirlwind culture that we live in, they get blown over.
Well, I think this is a great question. How it's a trend that you can find across many categories. It makes me wonder what is really being asked and what is really being answered, because it just seems that it could be a function of the time of the day and the issue you're facing at the moment, whether you are, what your view of these institutions is, and even at the population level, could reflect something in the economic atmosphere. You can't always be certain what you're measuring, and moreover, it's curious that people have consistently rated their own congressperson much higher than Congress in general. So, so what are we measuring when we notice a decline on the other hand, religious practice in that context? Well, you could say in some societies where you have very low trust, so Turkey, temporary Turkey was taken as one of these examples, that you actually had an increase in grassroots level piety, with, for example, this Gülenist movement that became then the basis for all sorts of interesting social processes. So, it could as well, in your describing some of these grassroots events, which could indeed lead to a regeneration, and which goes hand in hand with the synodalism that you're part of.
Well, and just to end with that, for this very quickly, I agree with everything that's been said. But to talk about the decline of trust, Michael Shawn referenced bowling alone earlier. Robert Putnam talks about how do we rebuild trust, how we rebuild social solidarity. That happens at the local level. And that's something I think you're seeing more and more commitment to now. We just had at the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life, where I am, we just had a conversation with young people last week on this. And it was so interesting to me and striking, obviously this is anecdotal, but stepping back, this strong desire to step back from social media, to engage in real life with potluck dinners and with getting together with friends, et cetera. And I think that's the place to start for our faith as well.
Did we answer your question, Eric? Eric always asks interesting and complex questions. Okay. Kathy Cavening over here.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful panel, and each of your remarks, I think, was really riveting and insightful. I have a question about the effect of kind of our dominant Protestant culture on all of these questions. And 2 points, one that Kim made and one that Mark made, brought this to me. You talked about Richard John Neuhaus in your discussion of the conservative movement as having started things. And one of the things that I remember that he said, and that was quoted a lot at that time, was that conservative Catholics, Protestants, and Jews have more in common with each other, because they're conservative, than with the fellow members of their faith. So there was a move toward a certain kind of Puritan purity, but it was political purity. And that was one thing that struck me. And then that moved into, well, if you don't hold these views, you're not a good Catholic, and we can talk about why later, but I want to focus on the purity. And then Mark, that poor sad girl who was at World Youth Day in Denver, cold, and wanting to see Pope John Paul II, who said how much she loved him. And then Peter Jennings said, well, he's got different views than you on women's ordination and what was it, abortion? Premarital sex. And she said, well, those are his opinions. Now, obviously, that's funny to a Catholic on one sense, but it's also kind of encouraging on another, right? Because she didn't say, the Pope has different views than I do on all of these things, so I'm going to walk away from the church. Or the Pope has different views on these things, so I'm going to cancel him and just leave. There was a sense that you could stay in the community even if you didn't have 100% the same views. So I wonder if our great sorting is also a response to the underlying culture of purity, that we can't be with people, we can't endorse people who don't think like us 100%, whether it's in the church, if you don't agree on contraception, leave, or whether it's in a political party, if you don't agree on abortion, leave, and how you think about that thread that's running through all this, purity.
Your question is about a big tent church, basically. And the young men in blue is the next question.
Well, just to go to the first part of your question, for sure, you've written so well on this, right? One of the big moves made by Richard John Neuhaus and the circle around him at the time was to say we have more in common with those who share our political beliefs around abortion, around same-sex marriage, et cetera, than we do with, say, our fellow Catholics, right? And so there's that division that happens then. And to my mind, and I think many see, right, that that's the next step from that is to say, well, let's throw in with a political party. This is an effort towards political power, and that I tried to lay out in my remarks. But I think it's that, finding common ground around public-facing issues instead of the kind of big tent church, here comes everybody, where we're all going to be. There's somebody who has a lane that is opposing the death penalty and somebody who has the pro-life lane that's going to stand outside of a clinic, and there's somebody who is going to be serving migrants and witnessing on that issue, and we all understand we are in the same, we're each working in our lane but sharing a common.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would just say I think the step in analysis that people forget is, and where I think we often get things wrong is what do you attach significance to? So he was saying these are significant, and they happen to have a political corollary, but obviously we don't share a whole lot with, as Catholics, with evangelical Protestants. The one thing that has increasingly happened in Catholicism with the move out of ghettos is the degree to which the faith has become privatized. Part of that, Mark and I had this discussion about Humanae Vitae and the significance of that, and did that start polarization? I think it laid the predicate for polarization. I think people have often made their own decisions about their own sexual morality and other things like that. But what it did was say it's okay to just say, well, the Pope's opinion is just one amongst many. It confused the notion of authority. And, we've got to reclaim some of that if we're going to remain a Catholic Church. That we can't just say, well, I disagree with the Pope quite so blithely. That there has to be, obviously, at the theoretical level. So I'll tell you a great story about, we just had the anniversary of his death, the great Monsignor Laurence Albacete, and he was, from Puerto Rico. He grew up in a Catholic culture, and he always would approach things differently. And so once we were talking about the issue of premarital sex and sex outside of marriage, and he said, well, Mike, when St. Augustine tells us that the conjugal act between a man and a woman open to procreation, even this is stained by the sin of concupiscence. He's telling us something very liberating. And that's always stuck with me. I think one of the things that we've done in our culture that Christian Smith in an earlier book touched on is this need to be affirmed. Like, I don't always get that. Like, I think it would be a much healthier religion if we just say, yeah, we sin because it's fun. Like, that's why you sin, but sin isn't just like something that has a bad consequence on someone's life or something that harms somebody. Sin is straying from what has been revealed by God, right? That's sin. That's the other stuff can be bad without being sinful, right? And I think we've got to recapture that healthy notion of sin. Oscar Wilde, and I always tell this to young gay activists who are like they want to conform and they they become very boring actually. And I always say, Oscar Wilde, the first time he tasted ice cream, he said, "This is so delicious. It's such a shame it's not a sin." And we've got to recapture some of that imagination. And that's very much a part of you think of historically Catholic culture, Spain, Italy, France. These are not countries that were obsessed with private sexual morality. Right? And I think we've got to get back to some of that.
Questions? Yes. Lady right here in purple.
Hi, thank you so much for being here tonight. I just wanted to comment, Kim, you brought up Citizens United and how that's kind of led to some Catholic advocacy organizations using the Catholic faith to advance political agendas. And I think this is definitely played out in cable news or email listservs or advocacy groups speaking on seemingly the behalf of the Catholic Church. And we've seen it not just in the faith sphere, but other identity groups too. I think it's just a communications problem at some level. People are watching TV at night and they think you have to vote for this person if you're Catholic, because that's what I'm seeing on my television. How do we as church, just people, kind of combat that? Or are we just kind of stuck on this train track and there's no turning back?
First of all, it's great to see you, and thank you for the question. And I'd love other people's thoughts as well. I would say this. I think that there is this kind of this ecosystem, as we've talked about, of media, of political organizations, of grass tops organizations, et cetera, that are out there and that are what I would say the issue is. There's part of the issue is that it's sort of a it's driven by political money. Our faith is sort of engagement around Catholic issues is driven ultimately by political money coming in and trying to drive a partisan agenda. But to my mind, the real issue is also that it's a selective group of Catholic issues, right? So it's not just a commitment to those sets of issues, which is fine. It's the commitment to the broader set, the seamless garment, the integrated whole of Catholic social teaching, which is what we're called to witness to in public life. And so what do? I mean, we can try to counter that. I think we can try to raise our own voices in our own lanes. We can try to be in these public spaces and these public conversations. But to my mind, the call is to witness to that seamless, integrated Catholic social teaching that we've been talking about.
And I'd just add something, I think we need better education. Kathy Caveney, who's sitting here, was on a panel in March, and she made the point that the bishop's document has this idea of intrinsic evil, and that there are certain things that you can never ever do, but that in a political context, that's completely the wrong category. And what I mind is they use that, and then they contrast that with those issues that require prudential judgment, and they use prudential judgment. Forget that it's a virtue, right? Prudence is a virtue. They use it as a get-out-of-jail-free card. Oh, well, I can support tax cuts just for the rich because economics requires prudential judgment, as opposed to abortion. But voting on abortion one way or the other is not itself an intrinsic. Voting in a legislature can never be an intrinsic evil. It's the wrong category, and it has a real moment in history. It was 2003. They were getting ready for the 2004 election, and they went to the Doctrine Committee of the USCCB and said, how do we distinguish abortion from capital punishment? And they said, well, one's an intrinsic evil, and they said, we'll take it. And they went on to say, well, it's not really the right theological category, and they don't care. And I asked an archbishop in Rome at the CDF, I said, this intrinsic evil category, he said, it's horseshit. I said, is that a technical theological term, Archbishop? This is, our bishops have to do a better job teaching on the whole subject of conscience formation, what it is, what it isn't, the varying ideas about conscience. For some people, it's whim. You can't tell me what to do. It's my conscience. Well, that's not really conscience. Conscience is God's voice in our hearts, right? So, anyway.
So thank you so much. So my question is more about the international implications, and obviously, America has been a leader in the international field for decades, and everything American government does is obviously scrutinized and followed by many countries. At the same time, when we saw Trump's election and his presidency, one of the first leaders to visit him is President Modi from India, who we know is a strong Hindu nationalist and pushing for Hindu identity in India and shunning Muslim minorities. On the other hand, we see the Pope Leo as an American at his heart. And so what are the international implications in the future of American Christian nationalism, as well as how the Pope can do, what can the Pope do to counteract or provide his insights into?
I would just say that it was a canny outcome at from the College of Cardinals at this moment in history to have elected a U.S.-born Pope. It helps, I think, to counterbalance what you're describing as the projected power of the United States throughout the world, and it helps to balance our profile, I think, in a very useful way at a time when there's a lot of fear of our country abroad and our instability, our unpredictable nature, our seeming heartlessness, and so of course, if you travel abroad and read about America or look at news reports about the U.S., it's hard not to think it's a caricature, right? Because when you're here, everything is so obviously complex and layered and textual. Well, this is one way to suggest some of that the context and layer of our national culture.
And just to say that, one of Pope Francis's great gifts to me, at least, to all of us, I think, is to, at least for me, remind me of we have a global church. And so I quoted him talking about resistance to authoritarianisms on the march around the world, and this rise of nationalism around the world. But he also just consistently brought our lens out from simply our own parochial lens to the broader world with the synod, with his efforts to draw attention in his travels around the world to those who were really on the margins. And I want to say for us in the United States, U.S. Catholics are 6% of the world's Catholics, just 6%. So that puts in perspective these kind of internecine arguments that we have here, right? At the end of the day, we're called to serve the voiceless and vulnerable. We're called to be reminded we're part of a global church. I'm really glad you helped us end on that note, and I'm glad, I couldn't agree more, that it's really a wonderful thing that on the world stage right now we have a kind and good American world leader in Pope Leo. I think that's wonderful.
2 points. One, remember when he came out on the balcony that first day, he started in Italian and he went to Spanish, not English. He is the first U.S.-born pope, pero él es el primero papa de Peru, right? I mean, his formation is Peruvian. That said, the effect on that 6%, and by the way, and the point on the 6%, like this whole debate about traditional Latin Mass, like we see that through an American lens. That decision was driven, start to finish, by what was going on in France. That was driven by the French bishops, and yet we see it through our lens. But there will be a very profound effect that Leo will have, not just as the kind of anti-Trump, and I don't think that actually helps him. I think it's an unhelpful characterization because he's a religious leader, not a political leader. But when we had this moment that I talked about with Durbin and Supich and these other bishops criticizing Supich. Leo was asked the question, and he answered. Substantively, the answer was exactly what Francis would have said. But of course, we would not have heard Francis's answer. We would have heard an interpreter, because Francis would have answered in Spanish. Leo answered in English. And what I recognized right then is that lands differently. And the conservatives who, for the 13 years of the Francis pontificate, said, oh, he doesn't really understand us Americans. He really, he's a benighted Argentinian. He grew up with Perón and, Evita and all that. That doesn't wash anymore because there's no interpreter. We're hearing him. And that will land and he's a young man. He's only 70. This entire pontificate will land very differently because he can speak on American issues in English.
The sweetest words of the afternoon were, he's a young man, he's only 70. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank all of you.